함께 다짐합니다.
예, 바로 시기 바랍니다. 잠깐만요. 예, 한 번만 더 하겠습니다. 다른 걸 좀 해야 되는데요. 왜냐면은, 물론 기본적으로 우리 5.18 영령들, 그 다음 유가족분들을 위해서도 해야 되겠지만은 또 세월호 참사 때문에 돌아가신 분들도 계시기 때문에 우리 5.18 영령들과 세월호 참사의 희생자들 위해서 간단한 묵념을 하겠습니다. 자, 일동 묵념. 바로 앉아주시기 바랍니다. 오늘 그 개식에는 원래 그 이재정 경기도 교육감이 축사를 해 주시기로 하셨는데요. 요즘에 교육 문제가 굉장히 바쁩니다. 일정도 많으시고 해가지고 오늘 못 오셨고요. 간단히 우리 그 기념재단의 이사장이신 우리 오재일 이사장님 모시고 개회사를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 5.18 기념재단의 이사장인 오재일입니다. 먼저 저희 재단 창립 20주년 국제학술 심포지엄에 참석해 주신 모든 분들, 특히 해외에서 바쁘신 일정 속에서도 발질해 주셔서 오신 린드 교수님, 또 타가 교수님께 감사 인사를 드립니다. 특히 여기 많은 분들이 오셨는데 광주라든가 또 서울에 계신 여러 네이빙 기분 여러분, 그리고 5.18 가족 여러분께 다시 한번 깊이 감사드립니다. 오늘 학술 심포지움은 21세기 동아시아의 평화와 인권이란 주제하에서 지난 30년간 연구된 5.18 민주화운동과 관련된 학술적 성과를 집대성하고 앞으로 나아갈 길을 함께 고민하기 위해서 마련된 자리입니다. 인류 역사는 민주주의 역사라고 합니다. 그것은 인간 삶의 형태를 규정짓는 요소로서 최상의 삶, 최선의 국가, 완전한 사회를 위한 끊임없는 질문에 대한 답을 해주기 때문입니다. 그래서 민주주의는 고대 그리스로부터 현재 이르기까지 많은 우여곡절을 겪어왔고 치열한 사회적 갈등을 통해 발전해 왔으며 종종 그런 갈등 속에서 많은 희생이 있기도 했습니다. 하지만 민주주의 역사는 매우 복잡하기도 합니다. 그것은 민주주의가 제도, 이념, 체제 등 무엇을 의미하는지에서부터 시작해가지고 주체, 지배 등에 대한 개념에 이르기까지 매우 많은 문제를 폭넓게 품고 있기 때문입니다. 중요한 것은 민주주의 발전 과정에서 역사의 주체인 인민 또는 민중들의 집단적 움직임이며 동서고금을 막론하고 민중들의 집단 행동이나 운동은 역사를 바꾸는 결정적인 요소로 작용하고 있다는 사실입니다. 그러한 의미에서 5.18 민주화운동은 한국 현대사에 있어서 정치 권력과 시민의 생명 문제에 한 획을 긋는 역사적 대사건이었으며 단일한 지역에서 일어난 것으로는 한국 역사상 최대 규모의 운동이었습니다. 오늘 이 자리는 5.18 민주화운동의 시대적 배경과 국제적인 비교 평가 그리고 국내적 평가와 그 이상에 주목하면서 애국의 발제자들의 시각에서 바라본 5.18 민주화운동이 동아시아의 평화와 인권에 어떤 영향을 미쳤는가를 살펴보고 다음으로 민주화운동이 성공한 경우와 그렇지 못한 경우를 국제적으로 비교해 보며 마지막으로 5.18 운동에 초점을 맞춰서 시민의식의 성장과 그 이후 변화를 다루고 있습니다. 아울러 최근에 보수 우익 세력의 조직적이고 치밀한 5.18 분리와 배제가 갖고 있는 함의는 무엇인가를 살펴본과 동시에 앞으로의 전망에 대해서도 내다볼 것입니다. 아울러 이 오늘의 연구 결과물들이 발표로 끝나지 않고 보다 충실하게 보완해가지고 금년 말까지 단행본으로 책을 낼까 합니다. 이번 학술 심포지엄을 계기로 5.18 민주화운동에 대한 학문적 성과가 보다 왕성하게 진행되기를 기대하며 한국 민주주의 발전에 크게 기여할 수 있는 계기가 되기를 바람하지 않습니다. 다시 한번 오늘 세미나에 참석해 주신 내빈 여러분께 감사드리며 특히 오늘의 행사를 함께해 주신 학술단체 협의회 김인재 회장님, 또 전 회장이신 안병욱 회장님, 그리고 또 한 번 오늘 국제 심포지엄에 좀 갑자기 끼어들어가지고 고생을 많이 하셨습니다. 사실상 이 손호철 원장님 사회를 보십니다만은 이분들 때 다시 한번 감사 인사를 드립니다. 또한 저희 재단이 여러 가지 20년 역사 속에서도 꾸준히 성장해 왔습니다만 아직도 미약한 바가 많이 있습니다. 그런 속에서도 이런 국제 심포지엄을 충실하게 해주신 정통현 팀장을 포함한 관계자 여러분께도 이 자리를 빌어서 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 고맙습니다. 네.
네, 감사합니다. 오늘은 사실은 이제 제가 간단하게 말씀드려 내려갈게요. 왜냐면은 이제 20주년이기 때문에 20살 생일이 된 거니까 여러 가지 문제가 있지만은 좀 오늘만큼은 이제 좀 박수도 많이 쳐주시고 즐겁게 이렇게 축하해 주셨으면 합니다. 사실 한국사회 학설대가 좀 딱딱하거든요. 좀 이렇게 부드럽고 즐겁게 신나게 즐길 수 있는 자리를 만들면 좋겠습니다. 이제 소개를 하실 텐데요. 그때 항상 박수 많이 쳐주시고요. 그죠? 졸리시면 박수 많이 쳐주시고, 따분하시면 박수 많이 쳐주시고, 이러면 좋겠습니다. 자, 그럼 첫 번째 이제 세션으로 넘어가겠습니다. 손철 선생님.
예, 첫 번째 세션인 동아시아의 평화와 인권 사회를 맡은 서강대학의 손호철입니다. 반갑습니다. 우선 두 분의 발표자를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 한 분은 그 미국에서 날라오신 제니퍼 린드 교수님입니다. 두 번째는 일본에서 오신 타가 히데토시 교수님이십니다. 간단히 두 분을 소개해드리면 린드 교수는 그 캘리포니아 대학에서 아세아 그러니까 태평양 국제관계로 석사를 받으셨고 그 다음에 MIT 대학에서 정치학 박사를 받으셨습니다. 그래서 특히 전쟁 기억 그리고 국제적인 어떤 화해 이런 것을 주로 공부하고 계시고 특히 동북아에 있어서의 인권, 전쟁 기억 뭐 이런 문제를 하셔서 Sorry State 그다음에 국제정치에 있어서의 뭐 변명 뭐 이런 책을 이와 관련된 책을 쓰신 이 분야의 아주 전문가이십니다. 두 번째 타가 교수님은 그 와세다 대학 에서 평화를 전공하고 계시는 분이시고요. 사회대학 학장을 하셨고 평화연구소장 그다음에 평화학회 회장을 하고 있는 평화 문제에 대한 가장 일본의 아주 그 최고의 권위자이십니다. 저희가 이 세션을 만든 그 문제의식은 광주의 정신 속에 가장 핵심을 차지하고 있는 것은 인권 그리고 평화라고 생각을 했습니다. 이때 평화란 단순히 어떤 직접적인 폭력이 없는 상태를 의미하는 것이 아니라 타가 교수님도 이야기하셨습니다만 세계적인 평화 연구의 그 전문가인 갈툰 교수가 잘 이야기했듯이 구조적인 폭력, 보이지 않는 구조적인 폭력도 극복되어 있는 그러한 상태라고 생각을 합니다. 이번에 한국을 방문하신 교황도 잘 이야기했지만 평화란 그렇기 때문에 부정의가 결국 구조화되어 있으면서 단순히 직접적인 폭력이 없는 상태가 아니라 결국 정의를 통해서만 이루어질 수 있다고 생각을 했습니다. 불행히도 그러면 그러한 어떤 광주 평화와 인권이라고 하는 광주의 정신을 볼 때 동북아는 그 어느 때보다 굉장히 위험에 처해 있다고 생각을 합니다. 21세기에 패권을 놓고 동북아에서 긴장이 완화되고 있고 그러한 것 속에서 특히 각 나라에서는 극우 민족주의적인 그러한 흐름들이 나타나고 있습니다. 그래서 이러한 문제의식에서 인권과 평화라는 광주의 문제에서 동북아의 문제를 바라보자는 것이 이번 그 토론의 가장 핵심적인 문제의식입니다. 사실 제가 그 광주 벌써 33년이 지났네요. 그렇죠? 34년이 지났습니다. 그 당시에 사실은 기자였습니다. 저는. 그래서 그 광주의 현실을 취재를 통해서 잘 알고 있었고 그것을 불순한 세력이 폭동으로 몰고 가려고 하는 신군부가 그것을 뭐라 그럴까 그렇게 쓰도록 계엄이 지시를 했습니다만 저희들은 그렇게 쓸 수 없어서 신문 제작 거부 운동을 했습니다. 그래서 신문사를 잘렸습니다. 그래서 제가 미국을 가야 됐고 그래서 교수가 됐습니다. 그래서 광주 덕분에 제가 교수가 되고 있고 그래서 저를 교수로 만들어준 가장 고마운 분은 전두환입니다. 그런 역사적인 저의 개인사를 생각하면 이 회의가 더욱더 의미가 있다고 생각을 합니다. 자, 저희들에게 1시간 반의 시간이 주어져 있습니다. 그래서, 사회자의 가장 중요한 임무 중에 하나는 시간을 잘, 운영하는 것이기 때문에 두 분에게 25분씩의 시간을 드리겠습니다. 그러면 50분의 시간이 소요될 것이고요. 저희가 특별히 다른 토론자를 두지 않았습니다. 그래서 오히려 저와 두 분의 발제자가 여기서 제기된 문제들을 가지고 좀 논의를 하자. 그리고 그것을 모아서 결국 두 번째 세션에서 또 논의해서 종합 토론에서 좀 더 발전적으로 논의를 해갈 수 있는 그러한 포맷을 만들었습니다. 그래서 25분, 50분 하고 그다음에 약 30여 분 동안 저희 셋이 주어진 문제들 가지고 좀 이야기를 나누는 그런 형식으로 진행을 하겠습니다. 이 중요한 주제에 대해서 25분의 시간을 맞추어서 이야기를 하라는 것이 지적 폭력이라는 것을 잘 알고 있습니다만 그럼에도 불구하고 사회자로서 그렇게 진행을 할 수밖에 없는 점을 양해해 주시고 그런 전체적인 진행에 두 발제자는 좀 협조해 주시기 바랍니다. 그러면 우선 린드 교수로부터 발제를 시작하겠습니다.
Thank you so much, Professor Song, and I want to thank the organizers and the planners who have worked so hard to make this very important event so successful. I'd like to thank the May 18th Memorial Foundation for inviting me to be part of this really important anniversary and really important discussion. American author William Faulkner famously wrote, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past." Faulkner may have been thinking of his home in the American South, where memories of the traumatic Civil War remain vivid in people's minds. But his words take us to areas of tension all across the globe. This summer witnessed violence among Israelis and Palestinians, their struggles in the present animated by conflicting memories of the past. From the conflict in Crimea to calls for succession among the Kurds of Iraq, contemporary political problems are strongly associated with memory of past human rights violations. Nowhere is this more true than in East Asia. Between Japan and South Korea, mutual distrust and failed cooperation is often blamed on their history problem. The way this problem is typically framed is as follows. Because Tokyo has failed to apologize for its terrible atrocities in the 20th century, Japan is preventing reconciliation and cooperation. But many Japanese protest that their leaders have apologized many times. They say they are being scapegoated by Chinese and South Korean leaders who are playing domestic politics rather than genuinely seeking reconciliation. Meanwhile, relations between Seoul and Tokyo, two major trading partners and liberal democracies, have worsened, while relations between China and Japan grow increasingly dangerous. Today I want to argue that when it comes to international reconciliation, the words of Faulkner are not always true. The countries can move forward from the past, but they must choose to do so. South Koreans and Japanese can choose how to frame the issues of history, the current framing or one more helpful to reconciliation. Under the current framing, future relations between the two countries will continue much as they have done, maintaining resentment among not only South Koreans but also among Japanese, and maintaining distance between Seoul and Tokyo. But there is another frame, a different one, that these countries might adopt, which would support a different future, a future of increased friendship and cooperation. A broader framing would focus not on human rights violations committed specifically by Japan, but would see those as but one part of the history of human rights abuse in East Asia. This framing would not only acknowledge Japan's terrible crimes against Koreans, it would also incorporate earlier Western human rights abuses and the human rights abuses committed by authoritarian governments against their people today. Such a framing is essential if Korea and Japan are to try to bring their societies closer and to increase their political and military cooperation. Before proceeding, it is important to talk about this history in question. During the years of war and occupation in East Asia, Japan indeed committed terrible atrocities against its neighbors. The Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, the sex slaves of the Imperial Army, the trauma of forced conscription and forced labor are all terrible moments, stains in human history. In Korea, Japanese authorities not only physically abused the people, but sought to eliminate their national and cultural identity. The suffering of Koreans, Chinese, and others at that time is important for the Japanese, and indeed all people, to recognize and understand. But how should this past be framed? Typically, discussion of this history has largely been framed around the issue of apologies. It goes as follows. Because Japan is guilty of terrible human rights abuses, it cannot be trusted until Tokyo apologizes for them once and for all. Now, to be clear, Koreans and other victims suffered tremendously and have every right to ask for apologies for as long as they want. However, I argue that for the country of South Korea, the apology frame, as I call it, is counterproductive for several reasons. First, Japan has already offered many apologies. Of course, statements from the 1960s, 1970s weren't all that impressive. But since then, we've seen some really remarkable gestures by Japanese leaders. There's Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, for example, who probably Koreans think of as a far-right nationalist because he visited Yasukuni Shrine. But Koizumi also visited Seoul's Sadaimon prison and made a statement in which he offered his, quote, heartfelt remorse and apology. After viewing the prison exhibits, he said, quote, I feel strong regret for the pains Korean people suffered during Japanese colonial rule. As a politician and a man, I believe we must not forget the pain of Korean people. Also remember Prime Minister Morihiro Hosokawa, who during a trip to South Korea gave the following remarkable apology. He said, during Japan's colonial rule over the Korean peninsula, the Korean people were forced to suffer unbearable pain and sorrow in various ways. They were deprived of the opportunity to learn their mother tongue at school. They were forced to adopt Japanese names, forced to provide sex as comfort women for Japanese troops, forced to provide labor. I hereby express my genuine contrition and offer my deepest apologies for my country, the aggressor's acts. So this raises the question, given these and other remarkable apologies, why do Japan's history problems with its neighbors persist? The answer is in part due to the fact that apologies cause backlash. Every time Japan offers an apology, puts out a highly detailed history textbook, or suggests paying reparations, conservatives there denounce this move. Indeed, in Japan, as in countries all over the world, apologizing for past violence represents a fundamental divide between liberals and conservatives about what creates a strong nation. We saw this in the United States in the last presidential election, where Republican candidate Mitt Romney criticized President Obama for his conciliation to foreign countries. Romney criticized Obama in his book, which was called, of all things, No Apology. Many people are prone to say, there's something strange about Japan because of the controversy over history telling there. Why can't they just apologize? Perhaps there was something about the occupation or something about Japanese culture that makes it hard for Tokyo to apologize. But this is simply wrong. Calls for apologies, reparations, and even just simple self-reflection have prompted outcry in the United States, Austria, Britain, France, Israel, and pretty much everywhere. Apologies routinely produce backlash because of democratic politics. Furthermore, apart from the normal liberal-conservative debates in Japan, we're starting to see another kind of backlash, namely apology fatigue. The Japanese feel like they've apologized many times, and their apologies have been ignored by their neighbors. For these reasons, demanding more apologies from Tokyo is not the route to reconciliation in East Asia, and indeed could be the route to a more resentful, nationalistic Japanese populace. To be clear, it's important, as I said before, that Japan acknowledge its past violence. If a Japanese leader denies this history and the suffering that the victims endured, this is unacceptable. It's insensitive to Japan's neighbors. At such times, Koreans and other observers have every right to protest such insensitivity. And in Japan, political parties should take action to discipline any of their members who deny this history. We expect the good people of Japan to throw people like that out of office. But unrelenting demands for apologies by Chinese and South Koreans will have the effect of alienating and angering moderates in Japan. These are the people who want to do the right thing. They aren't deniers, and they care about Japan's relations with its neighbors. But their positions will start to harden, and they will be less and less interested in cooperation if they feel Japan is being treated unfairly. One can only speculate why the conversation about East Asia's past came to be framed around the issue of apologies. Interestingly, this was just not the case in Western Europe, where Germany's post-war partners did not seek them. But let us abandon this framing now. It does nothing but antagonize Japanese conservatives and moderates and has sustained, rather than soothed, the region's history problems. Toward a more productive future, the conversation about history in East Asia should be reframed around human rights. Human rights abuses in the region have occurred in different waves. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, there were waves of European and American colonialism in which the Dutch and the Portuguese battled for dominance in Southeast Asia. The British carved up China. France colonized and inflicted tremendous violence on Indochina. And the United States, after the Spanish-American War and during its colonization of the Philippines, killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and committed terrible atrocities there. Europeans and Americans can and should do more to acknowledge their country's actions during this period. As we are always telling Tokyo, it's the right thing to do. The next wave of human rights abuses in Asia occurred during interstate wars. In the course of fighting 20th century wars in Asia, the United States killed and otherwise abused hundreds of thousands of Japanese, North Koreans, Vietnamese. And of course, Japan was a major perpetrator during this period, guilty of the terrible abuses I mentioned earlier. As many South Koreans have argued, Japan's truthful acknowledgement of these human rights abuses is important to improve its relations with South Korea and to assume a role of regional leadership. This brings us to the present and recent past, in which human rights abuses in the region are committed by governments mistreating their own people. Countries that previously committed human rights abuses, Japan, the United States, and others, no longer do. Today they provide freedom and prosperity to their own people and encourage the spread of liberal economics and democracy abroad. Some countries, however, oppose liberalism and engage in political oppression. The Chinese government abuses dissidents, respects political rights, and violently represses secessionist movements. In North Korea, in the late 1990s, the Kim regime killed, through famine caused through its economic policies, upwards of 1 million North Koreans. The regime rewards its loyalists and punishes, incarcerates, tortures, or executes those who are less trustworthy, along with their family members. South Korea was once a place where the government abused human rights. In the succession of dictatorships after independence, political dissidents were harassed, arrested, tortured, and killed. The May 18th Memorial Foundation recalls the history of the Gwangju Uprising, in which the people of Gwangju resisted against brutal military force. The May 18th Foundation should be commended for its dedication to remembering a key moment in which South Koreans began to demand freedom, democracy, and good governance. It is because of moments of bravery like this that South Korea has become a society that is among the world's richest, most creative, and most free. Indeed, today, in contrast to governments that mistreat their people, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and other liberal nations stand in stark contrast. They govern by rule of law, they believe in due process, they make their people prosperous and free. They generously participate in international governance and devote their time, resources, and talents in forums just such as this to promoting human rights around the world. In short, this is a different way to frame discussions of the past in East Asia. A virtue of this framing is that it no longer singles out Japan, something that the Japanese people deeply resent, which will make them less and less willing to acknowledge their past. Let's be clear, this framing is in no way letting Japan off the hook. This framing still mandates a reckoning with Japan's past human rights abuses, but it also mandates such a reckoning for other countries that committed misdeeds. But the framing draws a sharp distinction between the human rights abusing Japan of the past and the exemplary Japan of the present. It also distinguishes between countries that used to engage in human rights abuses and countries that today abuse their people. Across the world, countries that sought to reconcile have managed to forge a new narrative about history. They have proven William Faulkner wrong. They have proved that countries can, if they try, put the past behind them. Germany's neighbors, though so horribly abused, did not discuss the past in terms of a need for German apologies. Seeking to cooperate with Germany after World War II, the leaders of France, Britain, the Netherlands, and other countries framed the violence of the recent past as being caused by militarism and anarchy, to which the solution was democracy and European Union. The United States and Japan, though bitter enemies during the war, have crafted a strong military alliance and a deep friendship between the two societies. In East Asia, to solve the region's history problem, we should reframe our discussions of history. Japan must acknowledge its own guilt, and so should the many other countries that over time committed human rights abuses. South Koreans have an important role to play too. To the extent to which people want to talk about past violence, the conversation should not focus exclusively on Japan's World War II crimes and why Japan cannot apologize for them, but should focus the conversation on human rights abuses that all countries committed. But most importantly, the conversation should emphasize how Japan, the United States, Australia, South Korea, and other liberal democracies have moved past that, how today they treat their people well and demonstrate respect for human rights. And the conversation should highlight current human rights abuses in the region, which are principally done by illiberal governments against their own people. this conversation will encourage a more productive and peaceful future in East Asia. Thank you.
예, 린드 교수님이 하여간 소위 사과의 정치를 넘어서는 인권의 정치라는 측면에서 동북아, 특히 한국과 일본 간의 관계를 이야기해 주셨습니다. 결국 일본이 결국 계속 반복적으로 사과를 하기 어려운 이유는 일본의 국민성이나 이런 것이 아니라 결국 민주정치라고는 독특한 정치 속에 있고, 그러한 것들이 결국 오히려 반작용을 통해서 보수 세력을 강화시키고 그런 어떤 악순환이 있기 때문에 그걸 넘어서야 된다라고 하는 이야기들을 해 주셨습니다. 특히 시간을 또 많이 전략을 해 주셔서 요점을 저희 진행에 상당한 여유가 생겼습니다. 이어서 타가 교수님의 발제를 듣겠습니다.
Thank you, Professor Son. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And after the beautiful lady appears the old man, like a crazy scientist in appearance, or like a hermit in a deep mountain. And previous speaker is a native English speaker, and I have no experience to learn to speak English. In just 6 years, I learned how to read and how to understand. No experience to speak. So, you are going to feel some sort of uncomfortability. But I am very much honored to be here. And I would like to express my big gratitude to the 5.18 Memorial Foundation, especially the President Ojayo, to invite me here. I think the foundation is one of the most significant foundation in East Asia concerning human rights and peace. So many people in Japan knows the name of this foundation. And also, in my generation, everybody knows Kwanj incident, tragedy. And, well, I think at first I should say that I impose you the very much inconvenience, because my paper is written in Japanese, you can find. I make up the PowerPoint. I had a presumption that my Japanese draft translated into Korean. So that a little bit difference between the paper and the PowerPoint. And that is because of time. I was too late to submit my paper, so that they do not have the time. Anyway, I will start my presentation. Which one? This one? Okay. Here you have the print of the PowerPoint slide in your hand, so that you can trace. If you cannot see the board. At first, here is the policy implications. This is a very natural thing, but essential. We should think about following things: safety of the people's life and assets, guarantee of movement of people across borders, and sustainable economic development, maintenance of the natural environment, protection of human rights across borders, not only in one country, but across borders. So next is the policy lessons. So how to see the world, contemporary world, I just pick up 3 points here. Weight of military power has come to the limit as well as the degree of importance of nation states. The military power going to become less and less importance. They are losing their meaning. And issues in non-traditional security have been increasingly important. Non-traditional. And also the new trend, changing from regional collective security organization to regional cooperative organization is recognized. This is, I just pick up 3 points from the contemporary world society. And what about the region we are living? In contemporary Northeast Asian region, we don't have any sort of universal regional organization that has full membership of the countries exclusively in this region at state level. I mean, the regional organization composed by Russian Far Eastern part of Russia and China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. We do not have such a regional organization. And that means we have no experience to work together under the same umbrella by only ourselves. Of course, there are some regional organizations, including United States or some other countries in Southeast Asia, but purely, exclusively, the 6 countries compose the one organization. It's not existed here. On the other hand, local governments of this region have accumulated a track record of international cooperation in this region. So the menu this afternoon is a possibility of Northeast Asian community and peace in the region. What sort of peace we are going to have, and what sort of community we should have, and in that community, who is the main actor or main social unit? And this is my proposal, international regional organization as the first step. And concluding remarks. But the volume of my PowerPoint is very big, so I will skip for some slides. Well, I just mentioned to this one, late 1960 was a period very rich in paradigm shift in the field of peace studies. Until that time, peace means absence of war. But in 1967, one very young Indian peace researcher called Sugata Dasgupta attended the second International Peace Research Association conference. And he told about the reality of India. Look at that time, not contemporary India, in the 1960s India. Look at the street. There are plenty of people. They take seat on the stone along the street. And they are thinking, they have no money. What I shall eat in the next meal. And there are a lot of patients. They are lying on the street of the stone, made of stone. And they have no money to go to hospital, to buy their medicine. And so many orphans are going around the street. Look at the river. They are washing the costumes. And next to them, they cooking of the same water. And the next to them, someone doing something. they use the river as a toilet. See? And I also witnessed that they put the ash of the coals after burn, they put them in the water. So that is the reality of India in 1960s. And Dasgupta said, it is not war. But do we call this peace? He asked. We need other words to describe the reality. And then he produced the new word, peacelessness. It's very natural, but it implies a very big meaning, peacelessness. And the Norwegian mathematician and also sociologist called Johan Galtung, 2 years later, he arranged this concept to a violence. The opposite side of peace is the existence of violence, he said. But his violence is defined like this. As a point of departure, let us say that violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realization are below their potential realizations. We cannot understand. Just read it once or twice. And, this is, well, suppose this is full somatic and mental realization possibility. And then you finished your life. Then what you realized is just the green part. So that the red part is the violence. He defined the violence like this. And he named it as structural violence. Oh, yeah. You can see who commit the violence is the personal violence. If I punch someone here, I am the subject. You are the object. So this is only a personal. But structural violence is built in the structure of society so that nobody can see the subject. Who is committing the violence? We cannot know. He called this one structural violence. It is, I think, similar to injustice. And he taxonomized, classified the peace like this: negative peace and positive peace. The negative peace is only the absence of personal violence, and positive peace is absence of both personal violence, absence of personal violence, and structural violence. And the United Nations accepted this like this. You can access to the homepage of United Nations. You will find this figure. The United Nations is now designing the peace like this, and the positive peace is their target. Okay. So another giant of peace researcher, Anatole Rapoport, and I skip this. He made the change in the conception of war. It's not only the absence of war, but he defined war as the organized crime by war-making institute. So that he made the analogy to the medical science, and we need do like the medical science, so that we need the hospital. I think the hospital for this region is a sort of regional community, like European Union or like ASEAN we should have some sort of a regional community here. It will be playing the role of the hospital here. And in that community, political security community, military policy, which one we should take? There are only 3 patterns in the history the world society took in order to protect, in order to avoid the war. Number 1 is balance of power policy. And second, collective security. And third one is the cooperative security based upon confidence building measures. There are only 3 patterns. And this is called Richardson formula. This is the formula for the arms race. And look at the figure chart of the right-hand side. If the world society took the policy of balance of power, then arms race begins. So the possibility, when they take the arms race, the possibility of outbreak of war is 82%. And no war is only 18%. So that balance of power has no meaning to avoid, to protect war. Empirical data shows this. So we should abandon the arms race and balance of power. This is modeled by Bording, Kenneth C. Bording. It's about half centuries ago. You can understand, you watch the chart in your hand. And what is important is that this is not said by Bording. Sorry, I just imagine the MAD, MAD. In the state of MAD, there is no country which can protect their viability to any other country, because the military power does not decrease in the world. So the world is like this. And also, I am very much concerned is the autistic model made by Dieter Zenkers of Deutsch researcher. He verified that no clear relation between tension and armament. If the tension going too high, the armament going to expand. But if the tension will be stabilized in one point, maybe they will stay here in a black circle. And the tension comes to decrease. I mean a detente coming. The armament should be decreased. But the reality goes like this in the Cold War time, and also the contemporary time in China. And again detente, but the military power is going to increase and increase. This was verified by some Korean researchers to check the budget, military budget of China. So that the details are written in my Japanese version paper about the China's military expansion. So I'm skipping my slide. And anyway, from economical point, or political point, or military point, we need a regional umbrella. And inside the umbrella, what should be main actors or main social units we can expect? Because we have no experience among the states to cooperate each other. So I focused upon the organization composed of local government. And I would like to give you one sample. At first, from Europe. It's a very advanced example in Europe. We call UBC, Union of Baltic Cities. They have this kind of structure by 95 cities surrounding the Baltic Sea. This is the map. The red point is the participating cities to this international organization by local government. This is HELCOM, another organization. But I think this is very important because I think this is the catchment area. All the water coming from the land, going to the Baltic Sea. Catchment area, I call it. And this is the network of UBC. We cannot imagine such a many organization has making the sort of network internationally. Yeah, another slide. So, what is UBC? Here is the principle and mission. You can read it in your paper. So, based upon that mission, the UBC wants to be like this. So, do you think it is an economic-centered organization, the Union of Baltic Cities? No, it's not now. Among 1,000 committees they have, committees on business and tourism is the last one to be set up. And I made an interview survey to the officers of the cities, and they answered that there is no reason for the local government to support private enterprise. This is the other way around in this area, in East Asia. The economy first, business first. The local governments want to support them. It just opposite side of UBC. And since adopting the charter, oh yeah, how to back? Yeah. On the ideology of co-prosperity, or Northeast Asia, NEA has been practicing extensive exchange and cooperation project in various fields, ranging from economy and trade to educational and cultural exchange, environment, disaster prevention, cross-border cooperation. This is the regional government, local government organization existing in this area. We call it NEA, Northeast Asia Regional Government Organization. And this is very similar, the structure is very similar to UBC, but first they set up subcommittee on economy and trade. It is the difference between East Asia and Europe. This is the subcommittees. And your country, all of the local government, except Seoul, is a member of this organization. And this is Japan, and this is China, Russia. Magadan has already the member here. And Mongol, all of the local government is a member. And North Korea, 2 members. So this is the largest international organization in this region. They are following the model of UBC. So let's see what it's like in Europe. This is Europe now. It's contemporary Europe. It's different. What you are now imagining. What is Europe? Europe is like this. Every borderline, they have some entity composed by local government. Like this. The green part is a local entity. The structure is like this. This is the national border. There are 3 countries, nation A, nation B, nation C. And only one local entity, or 1 or 2, I don't know, I'm not sure. They make new entity, new social unit along the borderline. And they are now, the shape is like this. Europe is no nation state. Oh, this is Baltic. This is North Sea. And the budget to these entities come from European Union. Just passing the nation state. This is Europe. And a similar model is a GMS, Greater Mekong subsystem, in the China Peninsula. Now the transportation reconstruction has already finished like this. And they call it North-South Corridor. And this is West-East Corridor. And China is taking care of this corridor. And Japan protecting the power of China here. That means the Japanese government gave much money for this part and Chinese government for this part. And also, in the sense of fairness, I give you example of the state cooperation. This is only 4 countries, China, Russia, Japan, and Korea. And they are covering this area under the United Nations Environment Program. We call it NAUPAP. This is structure, and this is the degree of dangerous possibility to be polluted. You see, the green and the yellow and the red line is the possibility. They have the possibility to be polluted. Here is the Korean Peninsula. They have a very high possibility to be polluted. Japan as well. Because this is very old data. The Japanese government submitted this one in, I think, 1997, about 20 years ago. The density of the traffic in the Japan Sea, or you call it Korean Sea. I did not imagine this sort of such a density here, so that it is natural to be polluted. So I'm going to move to the concluding remarks. Yes. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. From the point of view of comparison, considering the differences in Europe, as repeating and extension of points as seen above, though, the following summing up is possible. Economic intentionality is overwhelming in East Asia. It is centralized, while there are regional characteristics, including regional disparities in each country. Local government has accumulated know-how of specific problem solving since they are working closer to the site. I mean, environment or human rights or something. The multi-layered non-state actors are less organized here in this area. And missing relation we can observe here, or divided nations still existing. North Korea and Japan has the missing relation, and I think less degree North Korea and South Korea, and more or less between China and Taiwan. And my proposal is like this. As soon as possible, we should set up international regional organization as a first step. And we should deal with the non-traditional security matters, like Northeast Asia Regional Center for Natural Disaster, for preservation of natural ecosystem, protection against international crimes, or the Regional Center for Human Rights. I think we should establish such a kind of organizations. Time is up. Time is over. Thank you very much.
예, 다가 교수님이 평화론에 기초해서 굉장히 이론적인 이야기를 많이 해주셨고요. 결국 발틱해 경험을 기초해서 결국 동북아의 지방정부 협회, Association of Northeast Regional Government를 주목을 하셨던 것 같습니다. 결국은 그런 중앙정부가 아닌 지방 밑으로부터의 그런 협력 이런 것에 주목을 해서 하고 앞으로 결국 동북아에 있어서 비전통적인 안보 문제, 결국 쓰나미 이런 것과 같은 자연재해로부터의 문제, 그 다음에 환경 문제를 어떻게 할 것인가, 뭐 이런 다양한 동북아의 비전통적인 그런 안보 문제를 다룰 수 있는 조직들을 만들어내는 것으로부터 동북아의 평화 문제를 풀어나가는 첫 걸음을 삼아야 한다는 것이 주 발제 내용이었습니다. 우선 시간을 잘 지켜주신 두 발제자 분께 감사드리고요. 또 아까 말씀드린 대로 굉장히 많은 시간을 필요로 하는 엄청난 주제를 짧은 시간 동안에 발제해달라고 강요한 그것에 대해서 굉장히 죄송스럽게 생각을 합니다. 특별히 토론 아까 말씀대로 돼 있지 않고 결국 유럽도 플로우에서 따로 질문을 받지 않습니다. 그것은 종합 토론에서 같이 논의하고 해야 되기 때문에 그렇게 하고, 다만 저희 패널 사회자와 두 발제자들이 같이 좀 고민하는 그런 화두를 던져서 이야기를 발전시켜서 그 내용을 가지고 종합토론에서 이야기를 할 수 있도록 이야기를 하겠습니다. 제가 간단하게 그래서 질문 겸 문제 제기를 좀 하고 그 두 발제자들의 내용을 좀 답을 들어서 그것을 더 발전시켜 나가도록 하겠습니다. 린드 교수님 글에 대해서는 큰 방에는 저는 전적으로 동의를 합니다. 사실은 제가 한국에서는 드물게 인권의 정치를 가리키고 있고 인권에 굉장히 많은 관심을 가져왔고 그런 의미에서 과거와 같은 좁은 의미의 사과의 정치, apology politic으로부터 결국은 human rights politic으로 바뀌어야 된다라고 하는 것에 대해서 굉장히 동의를 하고요. 특히 국내 정치와 국제 정치 간의 연계, 링케이지라고 하는 현대 정치의 특성상 결국 국제 정치의 이슈가 국내 정치화될 수밖에 없고 그러한 것들이 악순환을 이끌어져 가기 때문에 그런 부분을 풀어야 된다라고 하는 데 전적으로 동의합니다. 그런 시각에서 보면 특히 한국의 입장에서 보게 되면 두 가지 문제가 크게 마음에 걸리는 측면들 저도 강조해야 할 문제입니다만 사실 박근혜 대통령이 아마 가서 사과를 했습니다만 한국이 일본에 대해서 강하게 그 과거사에 대한 사과와 등등을 이야기하면서도 가해자로서로 한국사, 특히 베트남에 있어서의 과거의 행적이라든가 이런 것에 대해서는 상대적으로 사과나 이런 것에 인색한 그래서 어떤 인권에 대한 이중잣대 문제에 대해서 우리가 좀 고민을 해야 되고요. 두 번째는 친일파 문제입니다. 일본에 대해서는 섹스레이브에 대해서 그렇게 사과를 하라고 하면서도 정작 일제 기간 동안에 수많은 젊은 한국의 여성들을 섹스레이브로 가라고 부채질했던 한국인들에 대해서는 그들은 전후에 가장 풍요로운 삶을 살았고 그들에 대해서 비판하는 것을 금기시하고 있는 이러한 어떤 이중잣대에 대해서 우리 스스로 좀 고민을 해야 된다라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 결국은 인권의 적재라고 하는 보편적인 시각에서 일본만이 아니라 동북아에서 아시아에서 이루어진 전반적인 그런 인권 침해, 전쟁이라든가 또는 국내 정치 등등등 이런 것을 보편적으로 다루어 나가야 된다라고 하는 것에 대해서는 전적으로 동의를 하고요. 다만 이제 좀 미래와 관련을 해서는 좀 다른 시각을 제 문제를 제기를 좀 하고 싶습니다. 결국은 일본과 일본이 등등 여러 가지 과거의 어떤 인권 침해 등등이 있었지만 일본 또 한국의 경우에 광주 등등등의 이런 인권 침해가 있었지만 결국 동북아에서 보게 되면 한국, 일본 이런 소위 리버럴 스테이트, 자유주의적 국가들이 현재로서 가장 인권을 잘 보호한 국가들이지 않느냐라고 하는 따라서 북한이라든가 중국이라든가 하는 자유주의적 국가들에 대한 어떤 상대적 우위가 이제 나타나고 있고 그것이 더 나아가게 되면 결국 이런 앞으로 동북아에서 영향력을 크게 되게 될 중국과 같은 일리버럴한 국가의 영향력을 막기 위해서 리버럴 국가들이 같이 연대해서 움직여야 되는 거 아닌가라는 물론 그거는 그래 나오지 않았어 그런 함의를 가질 수 있는 가능성들이 상당히 있고 있는데 좀 저는 이제 하는 게 우선 물론 저도 그 점은 동의를 합니다. 그러니까 이런 한국과 일본과 같은 리버럴 스테이트들이 동북아에서 상대적으로 인권에 있어서 우위에 점해져 있다라고 하는 것은 동의를 하는데 갑자기 이제 읽으면서 떠오르는 것은 이제 샤르트르였어요. 샤르트르에게 왜 당신은 소련의 인권을 비판하지 않고 프랑스 인권만 비판하느냐 이런 문제가 있을 때 샤르트르가 한 얘기가 here and now였습니다. 나는 지금 여기라고 결국 내가 소련의 인권을 그러니까 결국 소련의 인권의 부재라는 것 또는 현실의 어두움에 대한 비판들이 과잉돼 있는 상황에서 나까지 소련을 비판하게 되는 것이 마치 우리 사회가 살만한 것 따라서 우리의 문제에 눈 감도록 만드는 것 스로 가서는 안 된다라는 것이죠. 그래서 휴먼 라이트의 담론이 결국은 휴먼 라이트의 어떤 보편적인 확대로 나가야 되지만 그것이 결국은 우리가 다른 나라들보다 상대적으로 낫기 때문에 우리의 현실에 눈 감게 하는 담론으로 흘러서는 위험하지 않은가라는 게 제 생각이고 그 질문에 대해서 이제 말씀드리고요. 그래서 그래서 휴먼 라이트 측면에서 예를 들면 일본의 아베 등등이 하고 있는 평화 헌법 폐지를 어떻게 봐야 될 것인가? 그것이 일리버럴 스테이트, 휴먼 라이트를 침해하고 있는 일리버럴 스테이트를 견제하기 위해서 불가피한 역사의 발전이고 또는 불가피한 휴먼 라이트의 보호인가? 라는 것에 어떻게 생각하시는지 좀 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 타가 교수님께 질문, 우리 같이 고민할 수 있는 질문을 드린다면, 저도 아주 전체적인 것에 굉장히 동의를 하고, 그리고 밑으로부터의 그런 움직임들이 굉장히 필요하다. 그리고, 결국 트레디셔널, 그러니까 결국 과거와 같은 안보라든가 하는 그런 하이 폴리틱, 높은 정치가 아닌 협력이 상대적으로 쉬운 로우 폴리틱으로부터 시작해야 된다는 것에서는 상당히 동의를 하고 있는 측면이 있는데 결국 그러한 문제로 해결하기엔 동북아의 평화 문제가 너무 심각하지 않은가 지금 결국 하이 폴리틱 정말 핵의 문제라든가 이런 정말 심각하게 진행되고 있는 그런 하이 폴리틱에서의 결국 직접적인 대립, 갈등 이런 문제들을 놔두고 로우 폴리틱으로부터 우회하는 전략이 얼마만큼 효과적일 수 있는 것인지. 그래서 문제는 어떤 듀얼 스트래테지, 양면적인 어떤 전략으로 이중적인 전략으로 한편으로는 밑으로부터의 그런 어떤 협력 체계를 하면서 다른 한편으로는 이제 하이 폴리틱에서 이루어지고 있는 그런 긴장들을 어떻게 견제하고 줄여나갈 것인가 하는 것들이 될 텐데 그런 문제는 어떻게 생각하시는지 이렇게 돼요. 우선 화두를 던집니다. 예. You can give some answers about the questions I raised.
I didn't understand it very well. Sorry. So you were saying that I'm sorry. I can't summarize back. I don't want to answer the wrong thing.
Because what I'm asking is, I already read you about the politics of human rights and the frame of the human rights, but what I'm worrying is your implication. I'm not sure, but it's saying that I also agree that Korea and Japan has the highest record of human rights among the Asian countries. But that implies that as such that compared to like the North Korea and China, we are better. So we should be proud and we don't put much effort to increase or enhance our human rights and make me deaf about our problems. So that is what I'm worrying. And another thing is, if we go further that argument, I can say that, like, think about the Abe. So we are the better countries in terms of human rights. So we have hands in hand, and we have to, it's like Asian version of what? Yellow man's burden or whatever. So we have to solve the problem of China and North Korean human rights. So maybe, my question is, what we think about the Abe's initiative to change the peace constitution. Maybe one can say that we agree with that because to enhance the human rights in Asia total, because China is a bad country in terms of human rights. So do you agree with the argument that we have to change the agree with the Abe's initiative to change the peace constitution to enhance the human rights in Asia, Northeast Asia as a whole? That's my question.
Yeah, I guess I see a future of cooperation between South Korea and Japan and other liberal nations. Obviously, they will keep cooperating to promote human rights around the world in the ways that they currently do in the United Nations, in foundations, NGOs, Track 2, as they currently do, as we're doing here today. But in terms of uniting together for the purpose of changing North Korea or China, that's not at all what I meant. Basically, I'm pointing out a similarity of interests and values between Japan and South Korea that I think is overlooked. Because it's very strange to hear people critical of Japan today, but not critical of terrible human rights abuses going on. So yes, we can and we should talk about the terrible human rights violations that Japan committed 70 years ago. It's right to talk about them. But it seems strange to only talk about those and not talk about the terrible human violations going on today that are committed by China and North Korea and, of course, governments all over the world. So I'm saying that it's important that South Korea see that it shares similar values and similar interests with Japan. And that's not often the way that it's depicted. In terms of movements by Abe, I think sometimes he has been tremendously unhelpful, and my government has expressed lots of disappointment at different times with decisions that he's made. And I have to say I'm just baffled by some of his government's decisions. They're deeply disturbing to me. In terms of the changes in Japanese defense going on today, these are important to keep in perspective, because when we talk about conservatives in Japan, even Abe, right wing in Japan, we're talking about some of the most dovish, peaceful positions in the world. It's for an American to hear Abe called right wing, it is truly bizarre. When in my country, a right wing position means we want to bomb a country. That's what the right wingers in America want to do. They want to invade a country. Right wing in Japan, they want to use military force to support an ally. That sounds like a very qualitatively different thing. And so obviously, Korean perceptions of the changes in Japanese defense and American perceptions are very, very different. But the important thing is that we have conversations like this so we can share our perceptions and learn from each other as these really important events are going on before us.
Thank you. Mr. Taga?
Thank you, Professor Song. I just skip in the explanation of the UBC, the Union of Baltic Cities. At the first meeting of the mayors, they had two sessions, two different sessions. One is open session to the people, and another is a closed session. It was not open to the people. And what they are discussing in the closed session by the mayors, not the prime minister of the state, they are arguing about the nuclear submarine of Russia. They passing through the Baltic Sea into the North Sea. So how to stop the nuclear submarine going through the Baltic Sea? They are arguing. And they submit the proposal to the European Union as the conclusion of the meeting. So It's a false imagination that the local government cannot do anything concern the national diplomacy. They can. They can. And also near Northeast Asia regional government organization, they did it in concerning the environment issue. They have been submitting the proposal to the 2-3 years ago at the World Conference concerning the circumstances of the natural air or something held in southern Africa. The local government mayors proposed to the international conference about the environmental program. So, and also I should say that as I wrote in my PowerPoint, that it is only the first step to connect with the state and state organization. We secure the place to communicate across the border. We don't have it. No. So at first we have focused upon the local government because they have already set up some sort of organization. So we can make use of them. As a first step, we got a regional organization, then it connecting to the state level. So we should think it in this region. It's the first step. And also the mayor of the Hiroshima city resigned 2-3 years ago, and since that time the movement itself has declined, but he was a leader of non-nuclear declaration cities in the world, and also the Peace Mayors City Conference. He was the chairman. Now it is torn down because of his designation. Sorry. So anyway, I can say that the local government commit the high politics.
예. 제가 사회자의 독재를 잘한 건지 시간이 원래 계획보다 15분 정도 남았습니다. 그래서 혹시 여기 일반 패널리스트들 일반적은 그렇고 질문을 하실 수 있는 분이 있으면 한두 개를 받겠습니다. 안 선배 하나 하시요? 마이크, 거기 마이크.
예, 안병욱입니다. 아까 린드 선생께서 그 일본의 과거사 부분에 대해서 한국이 너무 좀 과도하게 요구하고 있는 것에 비해 상대적으로 유럽의 경우는 다르다고 이 얘기를 하셨습니다. 독일이 그 과거사에 관해서 이웃 나라들에게 사죄하라는 요청을 받지 않았다고 그랬는데, 그것은 되돌려 생각해 보면 다른 나라가 과거 나치 침략에 대해서 사과를 요구하기 전에 독일이 먼저 자신들의 과거에 대해 성찰하면서 사과를 했기 때문에 이웃 나라들의 어떤 요구를 받지 않았다는 측면이 있다고 생각하는데, 그 점이 독일과 일본의 과거사에 대한 태도가 서로 다른 점에서 그와 같은 동북아 문제와 유럽의 차이가 나오지 않았나 생각하는데, 그 점에 대해서 좀 더 부연의 설명을 해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
저기 질문을 두 개 정도 갖고 한꺼번에 답하겠습니다. 자기 소개를 하고 이야기를 해주세요.
예, 5.18 서울기념사 앞에 사무총장 김용만입니다. 안병욱 교수님의 질문에 이어서 제가 조금 더 덧붙이려고 그러는데요. 이미 독일의 경우에는 여러 차례 걸친 사과와 더불어서 가장 최근에도 메르켈 총리가 폴란드를 방문했을 때 유대인들과 폴란드 장교들을 죽였던 그 숲에 가서 실제로 그 추모 행사를 했었고, 그 이후에 2차 대전 때 그런 독일군 전쟁 범죄 피해자들을 지원하는 부분에 대해서까지 아끼 없는 지원을 아끼지 않고 지금까지 그러한 일들을 진정성 있는 모습으로 계속 해오고 있습니다. 그런데 그것에 비하면 일본의 경우에는 오히려 아시아 각국의 태평양 전쟁 피해 당사국들이 아직도 일본의 사과가 진정성이 없다라고 판단하고 있고, 또 최근 들어서 특히 가해자였던 일본이 히로시마 원폭 피해자로 자기네 스스로를 포장하면서 아직 태평양 전쟁의 상흔이 가시지 않은 아시아 지역의 집단적 자위권을 행사하겠다고 하면서 군국주의의 부활을 노리는 이러한 일들, 그리고 위안부에 대한 강제적인 모집과 그리고 강제징용에 대해서 역사적 사실이 분명하지 않다라고 부정하는 것들, 이런 부분입니다. 그래서 진실과 화해는 먼저 가해자가 스스로 자기의 죄과를 규명하고 피해자가 용서의 뜻을 표하지 않으면 화해라는 것은 있을 수가 없습니다. 이건 정부 간에도 마찬가지이고 역사적으로도 마찬가지입니다. 그런데 지금 린드 교수님의 얘기는 굉장히 프랙티컬한 실용적인 경제적인 국제정치 역학 중에서 과거보다는 현재와 미래가 더 중요하다는 이야기를 하는데, 그러나 이 동아시아 3국의 문화와 그런 역사관계는 이러한 과거에 대해서 진실의 규명과 가해자의 진정성 있는 사과 및 그 실천, 그리고 피해자의 용서가 선행되지 않으면 이것은 결코 정리되지 않을 역사적인 문제라고 생각이 되고요. 이 일에 대해서 어느 정도
좀 짧게 이야기해 주세요.
어느 정도 합의가 되지 않는다면 미래의 협력과 화해 또한 쉬운 일이 아니라는 점을 저는 말씀드리고 싶은데, 이 부분에 대해서 린드 교수님의 의견은 어떠신지요?
여기 묶어서
유초하입니다. 충북대 있었습니다. 지금 과거사의 문제라기보다가 현재와 미래의 문제입니다. 최근에 일본이 보여주고 있는 여러 태도들은 실은 현재의 평화헌법을 실질적으로 무효화하고 일본이 재무장함으로 해서 아시아의 제1 군사대국으로 발돋움하고자 하는 데 있다라고 보이는 겁니다. 이 바로 오늘과 내일의 문제, 이것 때문에 한국이 우려하고 계속 일본에 대해서 실질적인 평화국가로 남기를 부탁하고 요구하는 것이죠. 이 점이 오히려 중요한 것이지, 과거사 그 자체에 대해서 꼭히 문서로 된 90도 각도로 고개를 숙이는 그런 사과를 요구하는 게 실질적인 목적은 아닐 것입니다. 예.
예.
Thank you so much for these comments. Regarding the first question on Germany and how the neighbors didn't have to ask Germany for an apology because they already apologized, they just did it on their own. Here, it's useful to look at the history because the timing was quite interesting in terms of the reconciliation in Western Europe. Basically, the Germans didn't start apologizing until later, and the reconciliations came before the apologies. So France and West Germany became very strong economic and political partners with no mention of any apologies whatsoever, without any German apologies given. And this is something that we see means that if countries decide it's in their interest to reconcile, they can do it. They can choose to do it. Germany, again, started apologizing in the late 1960s, but by that point, the French, the Germans had already become quite close. Obviously, we can talk about, as the distinguished panelist next to me spoke of different kinds of peace, we can also talk about different kinds of reconciliation and perhaps say, well, maybe they could have a politically expedient peace. They could have a politically useful but shallow reconciliation without apologies. But to have a true reconciliation, you would need to really examine one's history. That's possible. But it's still very important to point out that even without that kind of a process, without apologies, these countries truly transformed, remarkably transformed their relations in the span of just a few years. I think there is actually a really important difference between the cases we see of memory in Germany and memory in Japan and everywhere else. People usually say, what's wrong with Japan? Why can't they apologize? Why do they keep denying their past? What they should be asking is not what's different about Japan, but what's different about Germany. Because in every country, as I said, any mention of apologies for past wrongs promotes tremendous domestic debate, as I mentioned in my examples of the United States and others. In Japan as well. The one country where we have not seen this, at least not to the same degree, is in West Germany and then Germany today. The one country. Germany is the exception here. And the way it's currently framed in this conversation is that why can't Japan be like Germany? The answer is no one is like Germany. So that's an important thing to remember as we have these conversations about how to atone for the past. The second gentleman raised these issues about how these apologies are just a prerequisite for being able to continue in establishing good political relations. And this is absolutely, Korea's right that you can say that. But I just want to point out, Koreans have been saying this for over 60 years. And your relations with Japan are terrible. And maybe that's fine. I know the United States doesn't want that. We don't want to see that because we want to see these two countries with these good shared values, two strong allies of ours. We would like to see more cooperation and more reconciliation. You're such wonderful peoples. You should enjoy each other. You should benefit from each other. So maybe it's fine if your relations are terrible and if you don't cooperate. And if that's your goal, then we know what to do. You just keep doing what you've been doing so far. But the question is, maybe you want a different goal. Maybe things might change at some point such that cooperation with Japan looks like it might be in your interest. And so at that point, I suggest a different approach. It's important to ask ourselves to say, okay, so we can't proceed in reconciling with Japan until we get X. Some sort of apology or gesture or statement. So what is X? What would that be? Because I argue you've already gotten it. So I think what people are saying is they want to see more consensus in Japan, like in Germany, where the past should be examined, multiple politicians express regret, and that it's politically unacceptable to deny. I think that would be really good too, because these events should never be denied, as I said in my presentation. They should not be denied. They're very important events in human history, very important events for these two countries to remember. But as I said, contestation over apologies is fundamental to democratic politics. It will always be there, unless there are some very odd circumstances, as perhaps were in Germany, that made them not present. So the question is, what is that magic thing that has to happen before relations with Japan can proceed? And again, I would argue if it's an apology, Japan's given many, many good apologies. If it's national reparations, it's possible that that might be something that you would demand, that's a legitimate demand. And then the question is that politically acceptable? Probably not. So again, Japan has done many of these gestures. Japan has also done many terrible blunders and terrible statements, policies, such as we've seen occasionally under the Abe government, visits to Yasukuni Shrine, re-examining and thus calling into question the Kono statement about the comfort women. I would argue that those are very poor policies, and people are right to criticize Abe for it, and I'm glad my government did. But again, the basic point is we will never see an absence of debate about apologies in Japan because of the democratic politics that are there. And regarding the last question, I think I appreciate that you say, hey, it doesn't have to be an apology that Japan gives us. We just want to see that they understand and that they understand the suffering we went through, that they did to us. And I agree that there's so much more the Japanese can do. And I'm spending the fall in Japan right now, and I'll be having these conversations many times with people. When I observe the Japanese talking about history issues, I see that they become very legalistic. They become very, oh, well, as you see in the 1995 Murayama statement, and they make it very legal and technical, and they say, oh, well, according to this treaty, we do not have to pay reparations. Again, it might be right. Maybe they technically, under international law, don't have to pay reparations. I think what's missing is just empathy, a sign of empathy. I get that we hurt you. Isn't that what we all look for when we're mad at someone? I understand how I hurt you. That very basic thing, I think, is what's been missing. And I agree with people who are very critical of sometimes the apologies are very technically worded and highly negotiated between the two governments and this sort of thing. So I understand people who are very critical of Japan. And I can assure you that in my conversations with the Japanese about their history, and in my conversations at home as we talk about our history, I think this is a very important point to raise, this basic point about empathy. Because indeed, without that feeling of empathy, it will be very hard to move forward. Thank you.
예, 시간이 다 된 것 같습니다. 그래서 한 3, 4분 남았는데 하고 제 2세션으로 가겠습니다. 우선 짧은 시간 동안에 미리 좀 충분히 계획을 했으면 되는데 그게 아니라 굉장히 짧은 시간 동안에 페이퍼를 준비해달라고 부탁을 했는데 하여간 준비해 주신 두 발제자에게 우선 감사드리고 또 오후 이제 두 번째, 세 번째 세션도 이 이야기에 이어서 그걸 발전시킨 더 좋은 토론회가 되길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.